Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping straight into a massive constitutional debate that is literally shaping the future of a decentralized Eritrea. We're looking at how a nation, finally emerging from decades of hyper-centralized rule, tries to strike this incredibly delicate balance. How do you balance the rightful historical governance of homelands with the equitable economic development of the entire country? Specifically, we're going to break down a proposed framework known as the Afar model. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, the shared goal. Then, geographical federalism. Third, the Afar model. Fourth, governance versus revenue sharing. And finally, reconciling rights and unity.
All right, kicking things off with part one, the shared goal, decentralization and democracy.
Okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty differences, we really need to establish the baseline consensus here, because both sides of this debate, whether they're pushing for geographical federalism or the Afar model, are absolutely united on one thing. The extreme centralization under the current PFDJ regime just has to end. We're talking about decades of policies that have driven political erasure and resource exclusion. It's essentially operated as an internal colonization, right? Especially when you look at high-stakes geopolitically vital assets like the strategic port of Asab and that incredibly valuable Red Sea coast. So the shared ultimate goal here is to replace all that centralized domination with a democratic federal system that actually remedies those historical injustices.
Moving right along to part two, the geographical federalism proposal. So first up, let's explore the solution proposed by Dr. Nagasi Hadgu. His model focuses heavily on reconstructing Eritrea around its 9 historic arajas, or provinces. It's a vision of a fair, geographically based federalism. The core philosophy here is pretty straightforward. All of Eritrea's ethno-linguistic communities, from the Tigrinya to the Afar to the Kunama, they are all equally indigenous to the Horn of Africa. Because of that, he argues the country should be structured strictly by geography, not by ethnic exclusivity. The idea is to make sure the whole body of Eritrea thrives together, as one.
Now, under Dr. Nagasi's framework, managing the country's wealth is essentially a split system. He argues that macro resources, so think things like deep water ports, major subsurface minerals, potash, stuff like that, absolutely must be administered by the federal government on behalf of the whole nation. Why? Well, he warns that tying that kind of macro wealth to specific regions could fracture the nation into competing chiefdoms, and nobody wants that. But, and this is a really critical but, his model bakes in a binding, equitable revenue sharing formula. This means the province of origin automatically gets a fixed percentage of those revenues for local schools, roads, you name it. On top of that, local regions get 100% exclusive control over their surface rates. That means agriculture, pastoral grazing, and coastal fisheries belong entirely to the local communities.
Which brings us to part 3, the Afar model explained.
Flipping over to the other side of the debate, we have the Eritrean Afar National Congress, or EANC. They're introducing this concept of territorial or asymmetrical federalism. Their stance is that Dankalia isn't just one of 9 historic administrative provinces on a map. No, it is the continuous, ancestral, indigenous homeland of the Afar nation. The Afar people have a completely distinct language, they have a deeply rooted customary law known as Madeha, historic sultanates, and literally centuries of continuous self-government. Because of all these unique traits, which, by the way, were actually backed up in an independent legal opinion by constitutional scholar Professor Sebastian Grammond, the EANC argues Dankalia needs special constitutional recognition that goes beyond standard geographical boundaries.
So what are they actually asking for? We need to be super clear here. The Afar model is absolutely not a demand for secession or external self-determination. Not at all. What they are seeking is internal self-determination. That just means meaningful democratic participation, autonomy, and self-government entirely within a united Eritrea. It's a status that totally aligns with international legal standards, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Basically, they want to be an autonomous Afar state, fully integrated and functioning within the sovereign state of Eritrea.
Let's dig into part 4, governance versus revenue sharing.
Okay, this is the absolute core clash of the whole explainer. This isolates the fundamental disagreement over how natural wealth should actually be managed. When you put these two models side by side, the divide is crystal clear. Dr. Nagasi's geographical federalism is hyper-focused on equal revenue distribution, right? The federal government manages the big resources to ensure the cash is shared equitably. The ENNC's territorial federalism, on the other hand, zeroes in on governance. They make this really interesting distinction, arguing that revenue sharing is just about handing out public income, whereas governance is about actual power. Who holds the legislative authority, who oversees environmental protections, and who administers the land. The ENNC insists that the original constitutional title over these homeland resources has to stay with the indigenous people living there. To really understand the pushback against the Afar model, let's look at this exact quote from Dr. Nagasi. He argues, ethnic exclusivity over macro resources breeds disparity and war. It is not unity. His primary concern is that if one single region claims exclusive ownership over massive national assets, like the port of Assab or the Red Sea coast, just based on ethnic indigeneity, you end up completely disenfranchising the rest of the country. For him, replacing a centralized dictatorship with regional resource monopolies is just trading one kind of inequality for another.
But the EANC pushes right back on that. Their quote says, "The constitutional question is who governs the homeland. Natural resource disparities have never determined constitutional boundaries." Their main point here is that just because a region happens to sit on a ton of natural wealth, that doesn't mean the local people should be forced to surrender their constitutional authority over it to a central government. As they see it, indigenous self-government doesn't mean economic isolation. You can have national cooperation without relying on regional dispossession.
Finally, Part 5, Reconciling Rights and Unity.
So how do we bridge this seemingly impossible gap? How does the Afar model try to reconcile indigenous autonomy with a strong federal republic? Well, the cornerstone of their compromise is this idea of a shared joint jurisdiction framework. Under this setup, the autonomous state of Denkalia keeps its original inherent constitutional title over all its provincial lands and territorial waters. But when it comes to nationally strategic assets like that port of Assab or major offshore energy extraction, they are managed jointly through a federal-provincial compact. And it goes further. Resource revenues are split using a strict constitutionally guaranteed ratio. A set percentage stays in Denkalia, and a negotiated chunk goes directly into a national equalization and solidarity fund to benefit all Eritrean provinces. It's essentially a system designed to share the wealth, while keeping the actual governance local.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to wrap up this explainer. How does a newly democratic nation actually balance the equitable sharing of its macro resources with the indigenous justice of its incredibly diverse peoples? Do you lean towards essential administration of resources to guarantee national equality? Or do you enshrine local indigenous authority over ancestral lands to make sure historical exploitation never happens again? The path Eritrea ultimately chooses is going to redefine its entire future. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating debate. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.